Okay, now that we've spent several lectures talking about the background of Native Americans before the European invasions, and then we talked about the European invasions themselves and the Reformation, now we need to talk about how did the Europeans actually try to govern these gigantic continents and profit from them. So today we're largely going to talk about the labor systems that the Spanish and Portuguese implemented in the Americas to try to uh, get enough work done to make the colonies profitable to the home countries, and how the home countries tried to govern those colonies for stability and again, long term profit. So, first, we're going to talk about the native based labor systems and how the Spanish, especially, tried to govern those labor systems over time, and then we'll get to the transition toward African based slavery, starting in the mid 1500s, and then the Spanish and Portuguese attempts to govern those slave based societies. So, the big problem that the Spanish especially ran into, and also the Portuguese when they started colonizing the Americas, is that they needed a workforce. The Europeans largely could not import enough European workers, especially in the early 1500s, to get enough work done on a daily basis in farms or in mines or in manufacturing whatever they could of their own goods in the colonies to make the colony uh, sustain themselves economically. So they realized very quickly that they were going to need a large labor force under their control to get the work done to make these colonies profitable and attractive and motivate future European settlers to come to the colonies and build up the colonial economies. So the Europeans had to figure out where are they going to get those workers from. They very quickly, even in the 1490s, on some of the Caribbean islands that they started to colonize, tried to concentrate native workers into one place so that they can control those native uh, peoples and turn them into workers in these European built villages that they're going to start building throughout these islands. And these natives were very resistant to this, obviously. So the Europeans had to go to some pretty extreme strategies to force the natives to stay in European built villages. And that was largely very often to burn down the old native villages in the area so that they wouldn't have anything to go back to if they tried to run away. And the Europeans figured if they have nothing to go back to, then they will stay in the European village itself or the European farmlands. But even then, the natives largely refused this kind of cultural packing together, sometimes of even different tribes and different language groups. And they often reverted back to their normal native based communities and definitions if they could, even when they're under captivity by the Europeans. So the Europeans had a very difficult time trying to force different native groups into one kind of homogenized labor supply. And the same thing happened in the Portuguese attempts to do some of these same things in Brazil. They tried to lure natives into European built communities or farmlands and hold them there. But again, the natives largely reverted back to their own cultural ideas. Polygamy, especially, was very offensive to Portuguese thinking, Portuguese norms. So the Portuguese tended to try to assign groups, smaller groups of natives, as forced labor to individual Portuguese settlers in Brazil. But again, there's very obviously quite a lot of resistance amongst the different native groups that are being forced to work, and for pretty obvious reasons. One thing that especially the Spanish encountered, they learned that the former Mesoamerican and even the Andean kingdoms and tribes had used a kind of communal labor system, even a labor system based on taxation, even before the Europeans ever showed up. So, especially the Inca had used that kind of labor as a type of value or type of exchange value, like money. So, the Spanish tried to take advantage of that to figure out how to continue using that type of cultural expectation and cultural view of work amongst the natives for the Spanish advantage to make more money. So this eventually transformed into the idea that became known as the encomienda system. And an encomienda is an estate owned usually almost always by a Spanish speaking person, a colonizer, and could be very large piece of land, hundreds or thousands of acres, that basically they drew out on a map and included any natives that already lived in that land to be the natural native workforce for that land that is now owned by a Spanish colonizer. So that was the encomienda system. It was literally the Spanish got out maps and they started kind of drawing squares on maps to parcel out land to Spanish colonizers, and they said that the natives that already lived there in those areas will be your workforce if you are the Spanish landowner. So the Spanish government tried to control native labor and assign it out to the individual landowners just based on who owns what land and which native groups are already living there. The government tried to set some kind of limit on how many native workers could be employed on one encomienda. And they set a limit of about 300 workers per encomienda. But it was never really enforced very well, largely because the colonizers themselves were responsible for enforcing the law, and the colonizers wanted to get as much workers as they possibly could. So in the colony of New Spain, what is today largely Mexico, by the year 1535, so just a couple decades into this system, the average encomienda had 6,000 workers on it, so many times over the 300 worker maximum that the government officially set. And Hernan Cortez himself, the leader of the original conquest of the Aztec Empire, reportedly had an encomienda with 155,000 native workers, which was vastly over the government prescribed limit. And some historians even estimate that that number may have been a giant undercount of how many native workers he actually had in the lands that he claimed in the colony. So these encomienda workers, the native inhabitants, were hardly distinguishable from slaves on a daily basis. They were not paid, they were not treated well, they were punished severely, especially if they kind of formed conspiracies to run away or do damage to the landowner or the property itself. The original conquistadors tended to own most of the early encomiendas and therefore tried to set themselves up as like this colonial elite. So most of the early encomiendas went to the military men that helped conquer and destroy the Aztec Empire. And historians even estimate by even the mid-1500s, only about 5% of the Spanish population in a place like New Spain actually owned an encomienda. So it's literally the wealthiest 5% own virtually all of the farmable land in the colony. And again, these are mostly the families from the original conquistador generation. The native workers in this encomienda system were very heavily mistreated, and many historians argue that it was a kind of almost literal slavery for the Native Americans. And there was one Spanish-speaking person, a priest, named Bartolome de las Casas, who denounced and publicly wrote and spoke about what was happening out in the colonies. Wrote descriptions of what was happening to these native workers and described it as sinful and akin to slavery and grossly immoral and unethical and nothing like what the Europeans living back in Europe are kind of fantasizing that they're like the Spanish are there and they're teaching Christianity to the natives and the natives are doing work in return for that, and it's all like a win-win deal for everybody. And De las Casas really told the Europeans that that whole fantasy is a lie, and that the encomienda owners, the encomenderos, were basically brutal slave owners who treated the Native Americans inhumanely to the point of murder and death, and the Native Americans are dying off in droves. So it's a vastly unfair, unjust system. And De las Casas pointed that out, so that's one of his big kind of clings to fame even today. So the encomienda system was very angering to a lot of people who think about morality and equality and all these types of spreading Christianity and these types of things that a lot of Spanish people thought that their government was doing in the colonies, at least the people who lived in Europe and didn't have the daily experience of what was actually happening. The encomienda system also angered a lot of other people, especially the smaller landowners. Remember, only 5% of the Spanish-speaking population in the colonies actually owned one of these giant landed estates. So the rest of the Spanish landowners own much smaller estates that do not have a dedicated government-defined native workforce for them to use and abuse. So a lot of these smaller landowners feel very kind of economically oppressed, because if you're an encomienda owner and you have basically slave labor, you can sell your goods for a much lower price than a smaller landowner who has to pay for their labor or has to buy their land or something like that. They have bills to pay. They have loans to pay off on a monthly basis. So they need higher levels of profit to pay off their loans and feed their families. So these smaller landowners are at an economic disadvantage because the encomenderos have all this slave labor. So the smaller landowners start writing back to the central government in Spain saying that this encomienda system has to end because it's destroying the whole economy and the rest of us can't get by, and those types of statements. And the government itself actually feared the encomenderos, the encomienda owners, because they were setting themselves up as a type of elite landowning class, and they were getting rich. And monarchies in this ancient type of scenario, in these ancient type of societies, always feared their landed aristocracy, the rich people who own a lot of land, who make a lot of money off the peasant population, because they can save enough money to eventually hire soldiers and buy up mercenaries and those types of things, and can eventually threaten revolution against the government. So the central government feared the encomenderos also. And all this kind of debate and anger from several perspectives against the encomienda system eventually lead to a government pronouncement in the 1540s called the New Laws that actually gets published in 1542. So this does several big things to try to change and even end the encomienda system. Number one, the new law said that they would not assign any new encomiendas to any other landowners. The ones that were already created in the first 40 to 50 years of Spanish colonization, that's it. They're not going to build any more. They're not going to allow others to exist, to come into existence. And the existing ones, whoever owns it is allowed to own it for the rest of their life. But when that person died, that land reverts back to government control. So that was expected to, within about 20 or 30 years or so, the encomenderos who existed would be the last generation that were supposed to be allowed to own that land. And once they passed away, their children or whoever else wouldn't be able to inherit it. It would automatically go back to government ownership. And the new laws were intended to end native slavery. So ending native slavery is probably the most effective part of the new laws that actually went into effect and was fairly successful. The whole ending the encomienda system just didn't work that well, because once the government pronounced these laws, then they got a lot of complaints, and a lot of the rich encomenderos basically bribed and offered compromises to the government that eventually dragged out the encomienda system. For example, there's a revision of the laws a few years later that said that not just the existing encomendero would have to give up the land after death, and the government would take it over when the encomendero died. But there was a compromise that said the encomendero could leave their land to one generation of heirs. So the next generation, his kids or whoever, would come to own it. And then once they passed away, it would go back to the government. But of course, once that generation got old, there's another compromise that pushed it on to a third and later a fourth generation. So the encomiendas will continue to exist. They just get kind of smaller and smaller over time, over the next 100 years or so. But the new laws were intended to end it pretty much within 20 to 30 years, but it just kind of got dragged out through corruption and compromises with the government. But even then, because native slavery is ended, the landowners and the people who need labor, the Spanish who need labor in the colonies, are going to look to other systems of getting that labor. One becomes known as tribute, which is the Spanish government said that the native groups and tribes owed taxes on a yearly basis to the Spanish government because they've been colonized. So that tribute could be paid in money. It could also be paid in labor sometimes. And because a lot of these native groups don't really have money, or they've never really sometimes had experience with dealing with money in their own cultural history, they're often asked to instead perform labor, send some of your workers to the government to be assigned labor for 2 or 3 months or whatever, depending on local circumstances. The labor system of basically drafted short-term labor became known as the repartimiento system in New Spain, which is the Spanish colonies, and the Mita system in Peru, which is a Spanish colony further south into South America. And it's largely called the different words because repartimiento was already kind of spoken about and used in Aztec culture, and the Mita labor draft system was used in Incan culture in Western South America. So it's basically the same thing. Usually drafted workers for somewhere between 2 and 4 months. Basically quotas of workers would go work for the Spanish government and be assigned to different jobs in different areas according to what the colonial government thought was most useful. Just had different terminology in different areas of the Spanish Empire. And again, this largely meshed with Aztec and Inca labor drafts that had been used before the Spanish ever showed up. So the Spanish found it very useful to kind of build infrastructure, at least early on, the infrastructure that they actually build. And these workers for a few months would be assigned to major economic zones of each region. The worst jobs to get in virtually all the Spanish Empire were in the Peruvian silver mines, especially at Potosi, starting in the 1540s, where the Spanish literally just tried to mine this mountain to get as much silver and gold and copper and whatnot as they possibly could out of the mountain, the Cerro Rico. And historians estimate that of the native workers that were sent to the Potosi mines, about 1 in 6 died in the mines. So this was extremely dangerous work, labor intensive, and of course the native workers were not treated very well. The Spanish were there to make money, not to make friends. Another system that emerged became known as peonage. And this is a debt-based system where landowners would hire workers, often native workers, and sometimes even poor Spanish workers didn't have their own land. And they would basically sign them up to a contract where the worker would be given credit in terms of money or resources like seeds for planting in the spring or tools to use early on throughout the year. So the landowner would allow these peonage workers to live and work on the land, on the landowner's property, and would be given resources up front to allow them to do the work, but the resources were not free. The workers signed a contract saying that they're agreeing that they are going in debt at the outset to get the resources to work the land. And the idea was that when the harvest came in throughout the year, and especially in the autumn, at the end of the year, that the worker and the landowner would split the profit. They would split the harvest. And that sounded good to the workers because they get to feed their family for a year. And after splitting the harvest with the landowner, the worker would have some left over and they can sell it at market for money and maybe try to go buy some land themselves for the next year or something like that. But the landowners themselves were smart and devious enough to write up the interest rates so high on the initial loan of resources that it basically ensured that the worker at the end of the year would not only have to give over their whole half of the harvest, but they would also still be in debt. They would still owe money to the landowner even after all the harvest was given to the landowner. And the landowner would say, well, you didn't really break even this time, so why don't you work for me next year and we'll write up another contract. So this peonage system was a debt-based system basically to keep the same workers in the same place constantly in debt for the rest of their working lives, to keep them under basically debt slavery, so that the landowner would control the labor and would always get all of the harvest and the resources and all the profit at the end of each year. And it just cycled year after year and went on for decades and decades and decades. So that was another major labor system that we see popping up in the Spanish Empire in the Americas by the mid 1500s. One thing that historians often point out is that all these major economic systems, the encomienda, repartimiento, the tribute system, peonage, it's not like you had one system first and then evolved into the next system and then step by step until you get to the end. This was very messy. So each of these labor systems often coexisted in the same localities, and sometimes amongst even the same workers working the same land. So some might be mita or repartimiento workers, and working right next to them might be peonage, debt slave workers. And this went on for years and years. And even as Spain will start importing African slaves. So a lot of these workers work side by side in the same places in the same time. So there's not like a smooth, logical, or like step-by-step transition from one type of labor to another. It was very messy and they're all kind of intermeshed. Basically, the landowners getting labor by any means that they can think of and accomplish. So next section is, how did Spain actually govern all this? The answer is really not very well for the long term. The Portuguese, who owned Brazil as their major colony, and the Spanish, who owned virtually the rest of the Americas on this map in the kind of purple areas, they always have major problems with governing these empires. And it's a pretty easy problem to understand. It's the same problem that virtually every empire and every ancient government always had throughout human history. They are based on land. Their social systems and their economies are based in agriculture. And if land is the engine that produces wealth, if people get rich by owning land, they want to buy more land if they can, or they'll fight to try to conquer more land. And the problem is that some families, some landowners, gain so much land that they become so wealthy and so monopolistic in some regions that they can build up so much money that they can build castles, they can hire armies to work for them, and they can basically build up enough military strength to resist the central government's authority and possibly even start a revolution against the government, or try to assassinate the king, or something like that, start a civil war. So this is something that ancient governments have struggled with, going all the way back to Mesopotamia and early India. And it's something that the Portuguese and the Spanish Castilian government will constantly be worried about and have problems with. And this was especially true in the American colonies. for several reasons. Number one, because those types of military guys that would take big risks to go conquer big pieces of land, they're the ones who had launched the original invasions and expeditions and voyages of discovery and all those types of things in the first place, and often did so without clear government permission to go out and do what they were doing. Hernan Cortez is a great example of that. So right off the bat, the people that are owning the big chunks of land and setting themselves up as this landed aristocracy are almost by default the people that ignored government orders in the first place. So the governments are very concerned about those types of people becoming even more wealthy and more powerful in the American colonies over time. And of course, it's still basically a 2-month voyage from Europe to the Americas across the Atlantic Ocean. And there is so much time and so much distance that it's really hard for the central governments in Spain and Portugal to try to govern the Americas very effectively, especially if they're worried about, say, a revolt breaking out in New Spain amongst landowners. If a revolt breaks out today, the central government in Europe won't even hear about it until 2 months from now. And then they'll be panicked and have to make a decision, maybe send an army over to the Americas or a fleet or something to break the revolt. But it'll take another 2 months for that force to even get to the Americas to start implementing government policy. So if you want to start a revolt or a civil war or something in the Americas, you can get a 4-month head start, which could give you quite an advantage in preparing for the eventual government response and all these types of things. So the Portuguese and Spanish governments are always very worried about their landowners kind of getting out of hand in the Americas because of the personalities involved and just the distance and communication lag. So the Spanish government itself set up what it called the Council of the Indies to oversee all the laws and policies and the offices and the court systems and all those types of things for its entire American empire. And the important thing to realize is that the Council of the Indies is based in Spain. It is not in the Americas. Their office holders, their leaders are in Spain itself. Their archives are there. Their council is there making the decisions, and they have to dispatch orders to be enforced in the Americas. The original members of the council and the high advisors to the council were mostly experienced in Spanish civil law or religion, or were like lower court judges in Spain or something like that. So at first they're just simply appointed by the Spanish government to oversee the colonies. And that lasts throughout the 1500s until the Spanish government desperately needs money in the early 1600s, and in the early 1600s they make a big change where they are willing to sell offices, seats on the council and in the advisory to anyone that has money to give to the government. So of course anyone who really wanted one of those seats and was willing to spend a lot of money basically paying a fee to the government to get that position, they usually had some kind of personal economic interest in the Americas. They might be a family member of a trading company based in the Americas, or a landowning family in the Americas, or something like that. And they are basically bribing their way into government office to decide how laws would be enforced and what laws would exist for the Americas, for the empire. So, of course, that opened it up to family members that are corrupt, or maybe even if you're lucky to get some good council members that paid the fee and were still objective, they often did not have a whole lot of experience in the New World. They were from rich families, sometimes even in Spain. Maybe hadn't even ever been to the Americas yet, but they're sitting on the council that governs it, which obviously might, do great damage to their judgment and what kind of laws are needed and how they should be enforced and whatnot. So that's the Council of the Indies, and it is a council that is based in Spain itself, writing and enforcing laws and sending messages to the Americas to be enforced. Another thing that the Spanish do to try to control the colonies is create what they call viceroyalties. And these are like giant, just territorial definitions. So the viceroyalty is like the highest level of the administration. It's this gigantic piece of land. The original two viceroyalties basically broke the Americas up into two different sections, like a north and a south. If I could get my little cursor in here, there's this dividing line at Panama you see right here on the map on the left. So everything north of that line became known as the Viceroyalty of New Spain. So that would include today's Mexico, parts of Texas, and you can see it even reaching up into North America, Florida, the Caribbean islands, and much of what we today call Central America. And everything to the south of that line became known as the Viceroyalty of Peru. So south of Panama, everything going from present-day Panama down into South America, that is all the Viceroyalty of Peru. So these are two gigantic distinctions that encompassed each of them many, many, many different native tribes, many different kind of economic interests. For example, you'll get a lot of agriculture in what is today Mexico, but you get a lot of sugar growing in the Caribbean islands. So they have different economies, they have different tribal groups in the areas, they have different societies, they have different types of investors coming into different regions of each viceroyalty. So the problem over time is that these viceroyalties are just too large to actually govern. And even the Spanish government figured that out fairly quickly. And so each of these two viceroyalties were further subdivided into what they called audiencias, which basically translates as regions. So these are kind of sub-districts of viceroyalty. And even the audiencias were subdivided even further into individual districts and towns and things like that. So each audiencia had its own head administrator. They were usually kind of judges and lawyers at first, but especially as some of these colonies come under military attack by pirates or even foreign invaders, very often the Spanish would appoint military generals or colonels or admirals or something to be the leader of each of these regions over time. They were political appointees for a set term, and many of them often looked at their term of government service as like a tour of duty in the military, where they would be assigned to a certain place for 5 or 10 years or something like that. But their dream is always to go back home to Spain, or in Brazil to go back home to Portugal. And that they hoped that their stay in the colonies would kind of enrich themselves so that when they returned back to their home country, they would be wealthier and hopefully wealthy enough to kind of live the rest of their lives in kind of luxury as a rich person. So over time, and even really fairly quickly, the audiencias really became the most important kind of level of government because they were the most localized. They ran law courts, they collected taxes, they administered their province. They were the government that people had most contact with. The viceroyalty would be based in like the capital city, but if you're on a Caribbean island or something, you wouldn't have much direct contact with the capital city. You're living in another place, so your most direct contact would be with your more local regional leader. These types of systems, though, also created a whole lot of big problems for the Spanish government. And it's really a fairly kind of easy to expect problem. When you assign someone to govern a locality and they're far away, you can pick the most objective person that you could possibly find and send them out there to govern it. But once they get there, especially if they're looking to get rich off of this position somehow, they start they arrive and they announce their presence to the local elite, the landowners of the area that they're going to govern. And they meet with those elites. They go to parties with those elites. They get to know the rich people of the area. And very often the rich people who want government favoritism will bribe the local regional leader, the head administrator, to maybe look the other way when tax time comes around so that this wealthy landowning family pays much lower tax rates. Or if some family member has broken a law, they'll bribe the head administrator or the judge or whoever it is to let their family member off light. So in doing this, a lot of these regional leaders appointed by the government are getting corrupted. And that's what historians often call going local. They make contacts with the local elites, they become friendly with them, or they just get bribed by them. Sometimes they'll even marry into the local landowning family. So they'll become a part of the family themselves and have children with that family. So the government leaders be kind of enmeshed in the elite, powerful, and wealthy system. And the government knew this was going on, so the government keeps trying to appoint outsiders to run these local regions. But no matter who you put in that position, that potential is always there. And of course, the people are willing to use bribery and corruption to get their way. Doesn't matter who gets appointed, they'll find a way to corrupt those people. So this weakened the ability of the Spanish Empire to actually govern these colonies over time. Because if you have a ton of local and regional kind of political leaders and government appointed leaders who aren't actually enforcing the law objectively all the time, they're implementing favoritism based on who has paid them or who's giving them the best deal, then the place is not very well governed and therefore becomes unstable over time. And very often, especially after the early 1600s, again, when the Spanish government needs money desperately, they've declared bankruptcy and they're having all kinds of financial problems, they'll start selling even these local offices to anyone who's willing to pay to buy the office. So this becomes an investment strategy for a lot of people who become office holders. They often, when a local office becomes vacant for whatever reason, some enterprising young person might go to a local bank or landowning family or something and borrow enough money up front to pay to get the office, to pay a fee to the government to get the position. But their whole plan is, say, if I'm borrowing, I don't know, $1,000 from a local bank to pay the government fee to get the job, then their goal very often is to make more money than that back from the job while they serve in that job. So they're serving as a judge or a tax collector or maybe even the high administrator of the region, and they're looking for any way to squeeze as much money as they possibly can out of that job. So they're accepting bribes, they're maybe embezzling from the tax revenue, they're signing kind of underhanded contracts to give a distant family member money that they're going to or land that they're going to resell for great profit in a few years and try to get away with it. So a lot of these office holders are basically like investors that are going into office specifically to suck every penny out of that office that they can possibly get over maybe 10, 20, or 30-year term of office, in order to, very often again, make enough money to move back to the home country and live a nice, wealthy, posh life for the rest of their life. And of course, this also destroys the ability to actually govern the place. So a lot of these audiencias are not very well governed for one reason or another, mostly because of corruption and because the landowners are getting away with virtually whatever they want as long as they can bribe the local officials to get what they want. So it's basic corruption that we've seen throughout human history and very clearly still see today. So the richer people were getting away with this pretty well. But remember, they're only about, say, the wealthiest 5 or 10% of the population. The rest of the population really works very hard and they barely economically survive. So most even Spanish-speaking colonists out in the Americas, they largely work about 12-hour days on their farms or in their workshops or whatever they're doing. They tend to work 6 days a week for wages that became stagnant, especially after the mid 1500s, and stayed stagnant for decades. So they're not getting rich off of this. They're barely eking out a living. And so most of them are really just barely surviving. They are never able to save any money or buy land for themselves over the long term. And even they were even luckier than the ones who were left unemployed or who became ill from the trip or something like that and either starved to death or had to migrate back to Spain if they were lucky enough to get out. So this is a very difficult environment for most people living there. And it's only the really rich, say 5 to 10% of the elite, that are really profiting off of this. Some of the kind of more what we today call like middle class types of workers are basically artisans, people who make tools, glass workers or iron workers or horseshoe makers or something like that, clothes makers. The ones that are best at their jobs can sell their products for the highest prices, so they tend to make the most money on a kind of weekly and even yearly basis. But they're usually based in the cities, so their living expenses are higher, and they have a high cost of business. They don't just take a plow and go out to the field and farm all day. They have to buy the raw materials and the tools that they use to make whatever goods they're making. So they have much higher business costs, what you might call overhead today, which eat into their profit for selling their goods. In general, the Spanish Empire in the Americas goes through several cycles of economic boom time. So it's pretty good economy up until about the year 1550, when the big conquests really ended, which means that the conquistadors are not conquering any native tribes and taking new land anymore. So the Spanish Empire's economy in the Americas was mostly based on expansion and getting more land, bringing more people, getting more native labor, that type of thing. And when those conquests kind of petered out and stopped after about 1550, and the Spanish government actually declares bankruptcy in 1557, there's not enough more people coming in from Europe to the colonies to sustain a fast economic growth. And the economy starts to stagnate and won't really go into another boom phase until the 1590s. And another way that the Spanish tried to govern their vast territories in the Americas was to try to control trade, basically inter-regional trade from Europe to the Americas back and forth. And they used what they called the fleet system. And the fleet system is exactly what it sounds like. Spain would send a fleet on a yearly basis to get to the Americas, to run all of the trade, to bring goods to the Americas for sale, and also to buy up goods from the Americas to bring back to Europe, also for sale or unloading or whatever they're going to do with that stuff. So Spain largely developed a type of like military convoy system for boats to get across the Atlantic Ocean in the early 1500s, when they're kind of pulling gold out of the Aztec and Incan empires as much as they can, and out of the kind of silver and gold mines. And they're, it's very difficult to just send one boat across the Atlantic Ocean filled with gold, because it'll get attacked. I mean, it would basically be like if you went to a bank and took out several huge duffel bags full of cash, and just put it in your car and tried to like drive from Los Angeles to San Francisco or something, like hundreds and hundreds of miles. You're just going to hope that no one else has found out that you've got all that money, and you're just kind of putting up the freeway all by yourself without any protection, because if anyone finds out, they'll rob you and possibly kill you just to take all the money. And the same thing was happening with these ships that were going back and forth across the ocean laden with gold. They're getting attacked by pirates or by foreign countries or something like that, just trying to steal the gold. So the Spanish created this convoy system where the gold ship would be surrounded with military, naval ships, warships, to protect it and fend off any attacks against it. And so this is where this convoy system really started. But it really becomes fully in place, not just for gold and silver, but for just basic goods by about the 1550s. So the idea was that one big fleet would leave from Spain to go to present-day Mexico in May. So if I can get my pointer going again, it would come across the Atlantic Ocean, and it would run right along the southern part of the Caribbean islands, and it would go to dock at about Veracruz, which was the port city of what is today Mexico City. And it would stay there for several days. And they would basically unload the boat, and they would set up all these tents and trading posts, and they'd set up just kind of this coastal town at Veracruz, and they would trade. The stuff that was imported from Europe would be sold, and companies and merchants and landowners who had something to sell to Europe would bring all those goods to Veracruz for this couple weeks in May, and they would sell it to potential buyers from Europe. So there's a lot of buying and selling going on for these couple weeks or so at Veracruz. And once they were done, they would go from Veracruz, and the fleet would go and dock at Havana in present-day Cuba, and another fleet would come in, and it would go down to kind of modern-day Venezuela along the coast, and also down to Panama, modern-day Panama. And that was the fleet that was responsible for running trade to the southern viceroyalty. So all the people from South America, the landowners and the merchants and whatnot, would bring their goods up to those two ports, and they would buy and sell with Europeans at those two places. And once all that was done over a couple weeks in August, that fleet would also get going from those two ports. They would meet up, and they would go and sail to Havana and meet up with the previous voyage who had come directly from Veracruz, and they would sail back from Havana back to Spain at the next spring. And they only did this once a year. So these trading fairs that happen at Cartagena and Panama, at Veracruz, were big, big, big deals. Because this is the one opportunity for the colonists to bring their goods to sell to Europeans for export to Europe, and it was their one opportunity to buy goods that they need for the next year, goods that are made in Europe and brought to them. So these trade fairs were, your one big opportunity to do this, to stock up for the next year and to make as much money as you can for the next year. The government taxed these trade fairs to pay for the cost of running this fleet and the warships and all that type of stuff, and to get profit for the government, to get government revenue to be brought back to Spain. But because the trade is so limited, this does a lot of real harm to the colonial economy. There's a lot of landowners, a lot of wealthy people there that will bribe the government officials to purposefully miscount the amount of goods that are being sold, or mislabel shipments, mislabel the boxes, basically. And this bribery was so rampant that it was kind of an open and running joke amongst the trade fair. And of course, whispers of that got back to the government in Spain and really angered the government, obviously, because the government looks fairly inept at enforcing its own laws. But this fleet system harmed the economy in the colonies in two extreme ways. Number one, the merchant companies that show up to buy and sell goods, they basically show up with a huge amount of money, and they buy up almost everything. So colonial landowners, if they have a whole bunch of money, they go to the trade fairs, and they say, for instance, try to buy up all of the European-made clothes immediately on the first day. Because if you have enough money to do that, and you monopolize the market on European-made clothes, you basically take control over all of it, you buy it, then you take it back to your own storehouse, and you only sell it a little bit at a time to keep the resale price really, really high to guarantee your own profit. And of course, that makes those merchants who can do that very, very wealthy. And of course, they do that the next year and the next year and the next year, and they keep driving their own profit margins higher and higher. But it's also driving the price of clothes higher and higher for the average people to buy. And that's what monopolies tend to do. They monopolize a market, and they charge it whatever prices they want. And if you want that good, you're just going to have to pay it. And the same thing also happened on the other end. European buyers would come into these trade fairs on these fleets, and they would buy up as many of the colonial goods for sale as they possibly could. But remember that the fact that the colonists could only sell their goods to Europeans at this place for these set amount of days, it's very restricted. That means that the Europeans who show up to buy colonial made goods or colonial grown goods, like certain kinds of food and whatnot that are not grown in Europe, it's a very restricted amount of potential customers you have. So if I'm the only European coming in looking to buy potatoes or whatever grown in Guatemala, if there's 10 different colonial companies trying to sell me potatoes and I'm looking around and I'm the only one that wants to buy it, I'm going to offer a really low price because they've got no one else to sell to. And if I can buy their goods real cheap, I can bring them back to Europe, sell them for a higher price, and make a lot of profit for myself. So just basically a middleman, a merchant. So it hurt the colonial companies that are selling goods, and also the colonial societies that need to buy these European goods because they often don't make clothes and certain things in their own colonies, and they're reliant on Europe importing that stuff to them. So it's really the merchants that make a killing in this type of system. They make huge amounts of money. So this fleet system was really successful at the military convoys in previous years of moving the gold and silver back and forth to Spain. But the fleet system economically failed and did quite a lot of damage in almost every other way imaginable. And even in the 1580s, this goes on for a few decades, but by the 1580s, the yearly fleets stop arriving on schedule. And so the colonists don't have anyone to sell to in Europe, and they can't buy European goods until the next fleet shows up. That could be a couple years. So the fleet system is much less reliable by the late 1500s. And gaps between fleets very often last 4 years or more, starting in the 1620s and especially by the 1650s. It's just on average every 4 or 5 years. So that does even more damage to the colonial economy because it's further restricting their ability to import and export. Because these were the only times of a given year that they were allowed to do this trade. Of course, there's smuggling going on, all kinds of things, which the rampant smuggling made the government look even more inept because they can't control their fleet system. But there are attempts of Europeans to kind of sneak goods into the American markets illegally to sell for a high price because it's contraband. So getting back to the labor problem in the mid-1500s, the big problem, well, one of the big problems for the early Spanish colonizers is that when they start forcing or whatever way forcing Native Americans to work in their fields and mines and whatnot, the major problem they kept on running into is that the Native Americans die off in massive numbers when they're exposed, usually to European disease. The Native Americans did not have the biological resistance, the natural resistance to European diseases because they hadn't been in contact with those diseases. So when smallpox and yellow fever and those types of things start moving into native populations, it just wipes them out. You see, oftentimes entire tribes are killed by European diseases. And the few natives that are left are often too weakened to do the work in the amount and quality necessary for the the colonial economy to survive and make profit. So the Spanish, by the mid 1500s, started looking around for another source of labor. And the one they hit on is African slavery. So the Native Americans are dying off in just unbelievable, staggering numbers. And the Europeans at that point, especially by the mid 1500s, will start enslaving uh, Africans and bringing them to the Americas, because Africans and Europeans have fairly consistent contact with each other since about the early 1400s or so. So after about 150 years, a lot of African populations have been exposed to European diseases and they have survived it. And Africa is just much closer, and there's always been some amount of people moving back and forth around between Europe and Africa going back to ancient times. So the African population has much better kind of natural immunity to European type diseases. So Africans were much more reliable to live longer, to be workers in Europe or in the Americas. So the American colonizers start to import African slaves as replacement labor for the Native Americans that die off very quickly by about the 1540s, and it becomes pretty normalized by the 1550s. And the importation of African slaves will really revolutionize specific areas, specifically the Caribbean islands and Brazil, as they'll start building up new types of economies and new crops. So this is a kind of stylized picture, famous painting of European in basically an African slave holding cell, looking around, possibly a slave trader. So that's just one of many, many images that start coming out of Europe at this point, describing what the African slave trade is like. And the vast majority of African slaves will go to the Caribbean islands, as you can see here, and also to Brazil. Why those areas? Because those are the areas that are going to start farming sugarcane in massive quantities in the mid 1500s. And sugarcane requires a massive amount of labor. So some areas in Brazil and the Caribbean had been growing sugar since the earlier 1500s, but it wasn't hugely profitable because the Native American laborers would die off. So sugar was not massively profitable, especially in Brazil, until the beginning of importation of African slaves after about 1550. And then the vast majority, probably about 80% or so, historians estimate, go to Brazil or the Caribbean islands where the sugar plantations are. And historians today estimate that somewhere around 1.4 million African slaves were brought to Latin America by 1810, so over 250, 260 years or so. And again, the vast majority in sugar-producing areas like Brazil and the Caribbean, and a relatively smaller fraction, only about 6% or so, into the British colonies in North America, which will eventually become the United States. So as gigantic of a slave problem as the early United States had, say by the late 1700s, early 1800s, it is infinitely larger in the Caribbean islands and in Brazil. British and French, especially sugar and Spanish sugar islands in the Caribbean, would import a higher percentage per capita of slaves to those islands, but those islands were just smaller territories. So Brazil will always have the largest slave population, somewhere around 2.5 million throughout the whole colonial era. Historians estimate about as many Africans died in the fighting in Africa to capture slaves and then transport them across the Atlantic to the Americas. About as many Africans died in all of that as actually survived and were actually enslaved in the Americas. So for the total amount of slaves who made it across, and lived as slaves in the Americas. That's only about half the amount that were originally enslaved in Africa or died in the fighting. So this does massive damage to Africa and completely remakes the kind of societies in Africa and the Americas. It has a gigantic long-term impact that we're still seeing today. Slaves in the Americas often did whatever they could to resist. They would be punished for attempted resistance or conspiracies against slave owners or trying to run away or anything like that. Um, so this is a famous image of slaves working at a sugar mill. So this is after the sugar has been harvested off the cane and it's being refined off the cane and broken up into actual sugar. African slaves were horribly punished for conspiracies and attacks on landowners or trying to run away or any such thing. But even then, slaves tried to find ways of resistance. They tried to slow down the work. They tried to work slower in groups to lower the slave owners or the plantation owners' expectation of how much work could get done on a daily basis. They tried to break the tools that they were given to use to harvest the sugar or do whatever work they were doing in order to slow down the pace of the labor. Sometimes they killed livestock. The most extreme examples were to run away or to start some kind of rebellion against the landowners. A few could escape slavery. The ones who did escape often tried to run into the forest or run into the countryside and get away, and they would often even form free communities, free African communities of escaped slaves that the Portuguese called quilombos and the Spanish called palancas. So those were kind of rogue, independence-minded people who had escaped and are forming their own communities, out in the countryside far away or out in the rainforest or something, just trying to get away from being re-enslaved, from being caught. And our last section is to talk about how the Spanish tried to run these colonies for profit again. They're going to start making some big changes, especially in the mid-1600s, because the Spanish colonial system isn't functioning very well. The economy is not growing, so the Spanish government's going to continually try to implement new rules, basically, to try to suck more profit out of the colonies. The first one they create were the Consulado. This is a Spanish merchant guild that the Spanish government gave a monopoly to, permission to dominate the trade over the Indies, mostly through these fleet systems. So the Consulado was basically a group of merchants who got together and paid the government a fee, a very large fee, for permission to have a government-sanctioned monopoly over trade with the colonies, the Spanish colonies. And of course, then the Consulado used that monopolistic power to manipulate prices and exchange values in trade in the viceroyalties in order to guarantee their profit margins and push their profits higher and higher every year. So these are merchants, basically, who go in as monopolists, and they take advantage on both sides, the buyers and the sellers, to push their profits as high as possible. The problem, though, is that they are very profitable, but they do not reinvest their profits in infrastructure for the colonies, or roads or schools or anything like that that might push colonial development in society and economics to get the colony to grow naturally over time. Instead, these merchants would mostly reinvest their profit into next year's voyage because that's what they're good at. They're merchants. They know buying and selling. So they're trying to scale up their profit margins just through merchant activity. Buying and selling, importing and exporting year after year, rather than making bigger investments in the overall society. So that means that the profit that's being made in the colonies is being kind of sucked out of the colonies and is not being reinvested to build up infrastructure that would stabilize and allow the colonies to grow much more naturally. The Spanish government also wanted to control the colonial trade as much as it possibly could for its own profit. So it created a what it called House of Trade, the Casa de Contratación, uh, to regulate the trade coming from the Americas and arriving in Spain. So the rule was basically that the law said that any goods coming in from the colonies had to be unloaded in one place at one time. They originally defined the city of Seville in Spain in 1503, and that was the unloading point. So everything could be counted, the government taxes could be accounted for also, the government would take its share, and the colonial goods could, from Seville, be resold out to the rest of Europe. So at first Seville is the big city, and it goes on at Seville for a couple hundred years until the traffic becomes so gigantic that even the entire city of Seville cannot handle it, and the House of Trade is moved to Cadiz, an even bigger city, in 1717. So that's another major attempt of the government to control and account for everything that's being bought and sold, and for the government to basically take its cut in taxes to guarantee government profit. The major problem, though, for the long term is just looking at this map. Spain and Portugal are way out here in this little kind of offshoot of Europe. That is all of Spain and Portugal. And the populations of those two countries are trying to control two entire continents in the Americas. And they just do not have enough soldiers, money, materials, warships. They can't produce enough goods to directly control those two much larger land masses. And the Spanish government and the Portuguese government actually have even more colonies out in East Asia, in the Philippines, and in what they call the East Indies, this set of island systems off of Southeast Asia going toward, eventually down toward Australia. So they don't have the resources, they don't have the size to govern such a gigantic landmass. So fairly quickly in the late 1500s and getting into the 1600s, and we'll talk about this in a future lecture, other European governments will start to attack a lot of these Spanish colonies and these merchant ships going back and forth, because Spain and Portugal just don't have the manpower, they don't have the money or the resources to control this huge amount of territory by themselves. So after a while it becomes kind of open season for pirates and foreign invasion. So the Spanish colonies trade really collapses in the early 1600s. There's a recovery period right around the 1630s or so, and then the Spanish colonies are largely stagnant after about the 1640s. So going on to the next 150, 170 years or so into the early 1800s. And the Spanish government's going to try to figure out how to revive the colonial economy, especially in the 1700s. And the major attempt becomes known as the Caroline Reforms, especially after 1750, largely named after the two kings of Spain, both named Charles, from the mid-1700s into the early 1800s. So Charles kind of translates to Caroline in kind of upper crust elitist speak. It's called the Caroline era, or North and South Carolina in the United States is named after the King of England, who was named Charles. So you often get that kind of comparison. The Caroline reforms were based in the government has to admit by the 1750s that the colonial trade and the colonial economy is so damaged and so stagnant that only a major reform attempt will be able to kind of kickstart the colonial economies again and make them profitable to the point that it might enrich Spain again to be kind of a major international player. And a lot of this really starts in the wake of Britain had attacked Havana during a war, general European war that was going on in the late 1750s, early to 1760s. So Britain attacked Havana, the capital of Cuba, in 1762, and basically conquered the city and looted the city for a while. And that humiliated the Spanish government to the point where they decided to completely revamp their defenses throughout their colonies and also their administration. So they want to create one uniform tax structure, administrative structure, and kind of trade structure for all of the colonies, because that attack on Havana just blatantly revealed the weakness of the Spanish government up and down its colonies. And Havana and Cuba were one of the more profitable, better defended areas of all the colonies. So they're going to go through several steps of trying to reform their government and especially tax collection system. The first big step is to create new viceroyalties. They leave the northern one pretty much alone, but the southern one was a giant mess. It was too large and diffuse, and really the travel restrictions because of the Andes Mountains along the western part of South America just made travel so difficult that one viceroyalty could not govern all of South America, at least the Spanish ownership part. So they created a viceroyalty of New Granada in 1739, and this is the greenish area in the north, which is basically Venezuela, Colombia, Panama, and parts of modern-day Ecuador. And the middle area remained the viceroyalty of Peru. And the kind of southeastern area becomes known as the viceroyalty of Rio de la Plata. They also take the major step of what they call free trade within the empire, which is very different from what we think of as free trade today. Free trade today says that you can move goods across borders without paying import taxes. This is not a tax-free zone back in the Spanish colonies. Free trade within the empire simply meant that ports within the empire could trade with each other whenever they want, really, rather than having to send their goods first to Spain to be unloaded at Cadiz. And they did not have to wait for the fleet system anymore. And this is like a major opportunity for everybody in the colonies to acquire more goods and sell more goods and make more money, and the colonial economy starts to boom very quickly after all this. Historians estimate that the colonial trade at least doubled in the 1780s. So after 150 years of basic stagnation in the economy, suddenly it's growing again very, very fast in the 1780s. The one area that didn't really boom very much was the Viceroyalty of Peru, because it's not applied to that area, this new trade or free trade idea. And also the Rio de la Plata is just kind of so far away and somewhat isolated that it doesn't really grow that quickly either. So this kind of market-based expansion because of this free trade, the end of the fleet system, and natural population growth will start pushing more and more diversification of the Spanish colonies, and the tax revenues start to grow very, very fast. And Spain suddenly, in the late 1700s, is a major international player again, because it has the money to pay for wars and to launch invasions and do all these kinds of things again. And especially in the Caribbean islands, the price of sugar is growing so quickly in the late 1700s that those Caribbean islands are some of the most valuable territories in the whole world, because they're using slave labor, so they don't have to pay their workers. As long as they keep them under control, some of those landowners in the Caribbean are making massive amounts of money because the European demand for sugar is so high and they pay so much for it. But even amid all this massive economic growth, Spain still has economic and governance problems in the colonies, and one of the biggest problems is this giant gap between the rich and the poor. So the rich class, usually the landowners, people who own the mines, or merchants, or other type of investor class people, are much, much wealthier than the poor small farmers or the laborers in the cities or even the homeless people or semi-employed people. And this gap between the rich and the poor rise drastically after 1750. So there's a very clear line between the haves and the have-nots throughout the Spanish colonies especially. The Spanish colonial governments, what tax revenue they get from the mines and other prosperity, they largely did not invest in improving their roads or their schools or their manufacturing abilities in their own colonies. They basically did not reinvest any tax revenue they got into the infrastructure that's really required for long-term economic growth. So the colonial economies, even though the merchant class is growing like crazy, trade is growing, they're not setting themselves up for future growth to be sustained in the long term. And the agricultural sector in the colonies are usually have the most workers in all of society, bigger than mining, even have more workers than sugar production. But the colonial agricultural economies do not produce enough food for local markets. They are not making enough food to feed their own populations, especially in populations that live in mountainous type areas because they don't have reliable roads, which means that if you're going to get food or other goods to those areas for sale, you have to put them on pack animals and hire workers to move them up into those areas. So any areas that are kind of away from the coastline are very difficult to access. And if you have to pay a larger workforce with more animals, more days to get those goods into those areas, that means that to sell those goods for profit, you have to raise the prices even higher. So the kind of inland areas also continue to stagnate. But the merchant class is growing, and trade is generally growing by leaps and bounds in the late 1700s, especially after the 1780s in the Spanish colonies. And Brazil will also get into this level of economic reform to try to kickstart their colonies, especially in Brazil. And this largely falls under the purview of one very high advisor to the Portuguese throne, the Portuguese monarchy. His name is Sebastião José de Carvalho e Melo. And that's how he starts off. He is eventually so successful that he is given land in Portugal and he gets a title. He becomes known as the Marquis de Pombal in 1770. But his former name, he's in the government under that name until 1770. So he's the biggest reforming administrator for the Portuguese colonies. And he's kind of the mastermind to figuring out how to make the Brazil more efficient and more profitable for Portugal. Number one, he convinced the monarchy to pass laws that increased the monarchy's control, its authority over the colony in Brazil. And he said it was basically Portugal is so economically reliant on Brazil's prosperity that the Portuguese government has to very closely control the Brazilian economy. So with that authority, Pombal reorganized the Brazilian Council, the Portuguese system of government that made trade laws, collected taxes, enforced courts and law codes, and ran military defense, made all those systems much more efficient. He reorganized the Brazilian treasury and created treasury offices in each province in Brazil to make them more efficient at tax collection and moving the money back to Portugal. He also went after the power of the Catholic Church in Brazil. The thing that upset him most were the Jesuits, which was a specific order of Catholic priests who had been heavily involved in making loans and then becoming loan sharks in Brazil, and often smuggling goods into the interior of Brazil without paying taxes by the early 1700s. So this became kind of a clear running joke in Brazil in the early 1700s. So by the time Pombal gets into power in 1750 and gets influence, he wants to stop that. So he's going to go after especially the Jesuits in the 1750s and try to break their power base and bring them back under control. So the government first in the 1750s tried to kind of set make all of the Jesuit priests direct government employees with a government salary, and he set kind of a ceiling on that salary, so a pay rate that could not be gone over. But that plan had very little effect. The smuggling continued, and the Jesuits in Brazil eventually voted to reject a lot of Pombal's policies and kind of attempts in the 1750s, and that just outraged the guy who becomes the Marquis de Pombal. And eventually, he convinced the Portuguese government to just expel the Jesuit order from Brazil and from the entire Portuguese Empire in 1759. So after about 9 years of negotiating with them and failing, he convinced the Portuguese king to kick them out of the kingdom, which had a lot of long-term repercussions because the Jesuit order were some of the largest landowners in Brazil. They were tied up in some of the biggest banking systems in Brazil. They ran virtually all the higher education systems in Brazil. And they had close contacts with a lot of the slave-owning institutions and slave trading institutions in Brazil. So when they were kicked out of Brazil and the entire empire, it had a huge economic effect. The people who have been giving the loans suddenly disappear. So a lot of people in Brazil can't get loans anymore. It becomes much more difficult to run schools. So the Portuguese government basically took over a lot of those banks and schools and lands and whatnot, and ran some of the schools itself and sold the rest off at auction. So it really created havoc in the Brazilian economy for several years. And a lot of people directly blamed Pombal for that and eventually moved to get him kicked out of office. Another big thing he did was also, like Spain, he ended the fleet system and created a new system of individual licenses to individual ships and companies to carry specific goods back and forth from Europe to Brazil, starting in 1765. Then he ended all restrictions on coastal towns trading amongst each other in 1766. So he's largely implementing a lot of what will become known as the free trade in the empire system in Spain. This Portuguese system gets going a few years before it starts in the Spanish Empire. And he starts selling monopoly rights to especially slave trading companies in 1777. And a lot of these monopoly rights and ending the fleet system, all this stuff seemed to have a pretty good effect on the Brazilian economy. It starts growing. There's a lot of complaint about the attack on the Jesuits and how that damaged the Brazilian economy, and eventually comes back on him. His enemies eventually convince the King of Portugal to remove him from office in 1777, so he goes off into retirement. So you get a reinvigorated Brazilian economy in the 1760s especially, and it keeps growing in the 1770s and 80s, and then there's a giant boom in the 1790s. So by about the year 1800, Brazil is more profitable and more efficient than Portugal itself. So the colony has really eclipsed the home country by the early 1800s, and it'll cause all kinds of future political problems for Portuguese and Brazilian leaders that we'll get into in the next module.